All right, so you really want to get what this Border Act of 2024 is all about. What's it mean for border security, for immigration, and even what's happening with Afghan allies?
We're going straight to the source for this deep dive. We've got excerpts from the actual bill itself, so get ready to dig in.
Yeah, it's a pretty dense one for sure. This act, it's trying to do a lot. Funding, policy changes, even provisions for specific groups. We're going to see how it all comes together.
Okay, so let's break it down. Right away, you see the act throwing a lot of money at this. We're talking $210 million extra to the U.S. Marshals Service just for detention costs from border enforcement.
And then another $204 million goes to the FBI for DNA analysis. And they specifically say this is for samples from detained migrants. Kind of raises some eyebrows, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot for DNA testing. What are they thinking there?
Well, it could be a few things, right? Tracking individuals, verifying identities, maybe even building a bigger database. Definitely makes you think about privacy and how all this info is going to be used. Then there's this huge chunk of change, over $1.2 billion, to expand ICE's Alternatives to Detention program.
So is this supposed to be like the humane option instead of just locking people up?
That's the idea they're going for. But the details are going to be key. So imagine instead of being detained, asylum seekers are monitored really closely while their cases are being decided. That's basically these proceedings. Could be anything from ankle monitors to regular check-ins, even GPS tracking. Problem is the act doesn't really get specific, so who knows how it'll actually play out.
So they're funneled into this monitoring system, but we don't know what that monitoring even really looks like. What are the potential downsides here?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. Some folks are saying, look, these programs, maybe they're less harsh than detention, but they can create this constant anxiety and really restrict freedom of movement. It's complicated. No easy answers.
Oh, and check this out. All these big funding things are labeled as emergency requirements. What's that about? Well, by calling it an emergency, it lets them bypass the usual spending limits.
Right.
Shows you how serious they're taking things at the border.
Right. Okay. So moving on. The act goes deep on tech too. Customs and Border Protection, they're getting a bunch of money to buy and roll out all this non-intrusive inspection technology, and they want the latest and greatest, specifically calling out AI and machine learning.
Yeah, this is where it gets interesting. It raises a big question. Is this really just about efficiency? Or are they moving towards automating border control? Maybe even replacing human agents?
Now, that's kind of scary. Like, what happens to the human element in all this?
We'll have to watch that closely. The Act says CBP has to give quarterly updates on how this tech's affecting things, like how many vehicles they're scanning, how much contraband they're grabbing, even how it's changing staffing needs. So we'll see if it's all about efficiency or if there's more to it.
Okay, so now here's where things get really interesting. The Act introduces this whole new process. They call it provisional non-custodial removal proceedings for certain asylum seekers. What is that?
It's for people who say they'll be persecuted or tortured if they go back to their home country and who arrive during a specific situation at the border. Basically, instead of being detained, they're released. But they're put into this alternatives to detention program we were just talking about.
It sounds like they're trying to be more lenient, but I'm still not clear on how these proceedings work. Walk me through it.
So picture this, right? Someone arrives seeking asylum. They say they're afraid to go back. Under these new proceedings, they're not detained, but they are enrolled in this monitoring program. Regular check-ins with ICE, maybe electronic monitoring, or other ways to make sure they don't just disappear while waiting for their case to be decided.
So they're free, but not really free.
Yeah, it's this weird limbo, waiting for their case while the government's watching them. And again, the Act doesn't say what that monitoring really looks like or how restrictive it could be.
All right, so let's say someone is in these non-custodial proceedings. What happens next? Can they still get asylum?
They can, but they've got two different protection determination processes to go through. First, there's a screening that happens really quickly, right when they get there. If they don't pass that, there's a second one, more in depth.
So it's like 2 strikes and you're out. What happens if they fail both?
If they miss their hearings or if their claims get rejected, they can be removed really fast without any more hearings, basically deported quickly.
Wow, that's harsh. Are there any exceptions?
It mentions exceptions for, like, exceptional circumstances, but it doesn't say what those are. It's vague. So there's some ambiguity, and it makes you wonder, will everyone really get a fair shot to make their case?
Man, this is high stakes. Seems like missing a hearing could have huge consequences.
Oh, absolutely. This is where you worry about due process and legal representation,
Yeah.
especially for people who are vulnerable, maybe don't understand the system or their rights, might not even know what exceptional circumstances means or how to prove it applies to them.
Then there's this whole thing about voluntary departure. The Act changes things so someone can choose to leave before a removal order is even issued.
Right, so it could be a way to skip the stress of a long legal fight. But there's a 10-year ban. They pick this seemingly easier option, but they can't get asylum or a green card for a decade.
That's a big decision with lasting consequences. Who would actually choose that?
Maybe someone who feels totally hopeless about their case. They want to avoid being detained for ages or going through the whole legal mess. But it's a gamble, right?
Yep.
Closes the door on coming back legally for 10 years.
Okay, now what about this border emergency thing? The Act lets the Secretary of Homeland Security just declare a border emergency if they meet certain conditions, like if 5,000 migrants a day show up for a week.
And if that happens, the whole asylum process changes big time. A lot of people would be put into expedited removal. They get limited chances to appeal or try for other protections.
So basically, they're on the fast track to deportation. What's the impact going to be on people who need asylum?
It definitely makes you worried about whether they'll even have enough time to prepare their cases, get evidence, find a lawyer. Could mean people are denied a fair hearing.
Okay, but here's something more positive. Amidst all this tougher stuff, there's a part of the Act specifically about supporting Afghan allies.
Yeah, this is where they acknowledge the Afghans who worked with the U.S., military government during the war, people who face risks because of that. They're offering refugee status and even a new kind of special immigrant visa.
Okay, good to hear that. So they're trying to balance tighter controls with taking care of the people who helped us.
It's definitely a complicated situation. Trying to manage security and humanitarian concerns at the same time. It'll be interesting to see how those competing priorities actually play out in real life.
Okay, last thing before we move on. The Act changes work authorizations for asylum seekers. Now they have to wait longer to be eligible, plus there are exceptions based on how they got here.
That's a big one. It directly affects whether asylum seekers can support themselves while waiting for their cases to get decided. Delaying work authorization could push people into really tough situations, make them vulnerable to being taken advantage of.
And there's also parts about making sure unaccompanied children and people who are mentally incompetent in immigration proceedings have legal representation.
Right, that's huge. Making sure everyone has a lawyer is super important for fairness and access to justice, especially for the most vulnerable folks in the system. Recognizes that we need to protect their rights and make sure they're not at a disadvantage in court.
Man, it's a lot to absorb. We talked about funding different agencies, new tech at the border, changes to how asylum works, provisions for Afghan allies, and even work authorizations. And we're just scratching the surface here. There's still so much more to unpack in this act.
Yeah, no doubt about it. We've only just started to peel back the layers of this thing. One area that really jumps out is how much they're focused on upping enforcement. Like, the Act gives both USCIS and ICE direct hiring authority. They can fast-track hiring for certain jobs.
So they're really bulking up. What's the thinking there?
Seems like they're expecting a lot more work. With border enforcement and all the immigration cases coming through, the Act even waives those restrictions on rehiring retired civilians, which is a sign of how urgently they want to fill these positions.
But is just hiring more people really the answer? I mean, there have been all these concerns about, power abuses, lack of accountability in these agencies. Does the Act even address that?
It tries to. It mandates more training for Border Patrol agents. Stuff like de-escalation tactics, cultural sensitivity, protecting civil rights.
So it's not just adding more people, it's about changing how they do things.
Exactly. It's the how, not just the how many. Whether the training actually works to prevent misconduct, that's a whole other story. Depends on how good the training is and how seriously they take it.
One thing that caught my eye was this part that lets certain non-officer personnel in CBP and ICE prepare these notices to appear for immigration court.
Oh yeah, that's a big change. These notices are basically what kicks off the whole removal process for someone who's here illegally. By letting support staff handle some of the paperwork, it frees up the officers to focus on, enforcing things.
But doesn't that, raise concerns about mistakes, inconsistencies in those notices? Especially if these support staff folks aren't experts in immigration law.
That's a good point. The Act says they'll need training for this, but it's not clear how much or how rigorous it'll be. We'll need to keep an eye on this to make sure it doesn't lead to errors that could really mess up someone's case.
It seems like a lot's riding on that training being good enough.
Okay, let's switch gears for a second and talk about the Alternatives to Detention program. We touched on it before.
Yeah.
The Act puts money specifically towards expanding and improving it.
Yeah, it seems like they're moving away from relying only on detention centers. Instead, they're looking at these alternative ways to monitor people while they're waiting for their immigration proceedings.
But what do these alternatives actually look like? Are they really more humane than just locking people up?
Well, the Act itself doesn't go into a lot of detail. We know it could be things like ankle monitors, GPS tracking, regular check-ins with IC, but the specifics, those are up to IC. So there could be a pretty wide range of approaches. Some might be pretty hands-off, others could be super restrictive.
So there's a lot of uncertainty about how this will actually work and what it will mean for people's lives. Yeah, exactly. And there are definitely worries about them going too far. If there aren't clear guidelines and oversight, these alternatives could end up being pretty harsh, even if they're not officially detention. Transparency and accountability are going to be key here.
Another thing that stood out to me was this part about voluntary repatriation. Basically, they're offering money to people who agree to leave the country on their own.
Right. They're saying it's a way to reduce the strain on the immigration system, encourage people to go back home, but it's definitely controversial.
I don't know, it feels like they're pushing people to give up on their cases, maybe without really understanding their rights or having a chance to fight back.
That's a valid concern. There's definitely a risk that people, especially those who don't have a lawyer or understand how complicated this all is, might feel pressured to take the money even if it's not the best thing for them.
And remember, a lot of these people are running from dangerous situations back home. Deciding to go back isn't something to take lightly.
For sure.
Yeah.
Any program like this needs to have strong safeguards to make sure people are really making a free and informed choice and that they're not being sent back into danger.
The Act also gets really specific about how asylum is processed, setting strict timelines for doing interviews and making decisions. They want to do those credible fear interviews within 24 hours of someone arriving, and then make a decision on their case within 90 days.
Yeah, it's all about speed. Trying to clear the huge backlog of asylum cases, make the whole system more efficient. But it makes you wonder, will rushing things like this make the decisions less fair? Will they still be thorough?
Trying to balance speed and accuracy can be tough, especially when you're dealing with cases that would totally change someone's life.
Right. If they rush it, people might not have time to get evidence, talk to a lawyer, fully explain why they need asylum.
And these decisions are huge. Stay in the U.S. or get deported. They have to be made carefully and fairly.
Absolutely. And then there's this new thing, a protection appellate board to handle appeals if someone's asylum request is denied.
So like a special court just for asylum cases.
Exactly. The idea is to streamline appeals and make sure the decisions are consistent. But whether it actually works will depend on who ends up on this board and how they run things.
Always a risk with a specialized group like that. Could get too focused on speed and forget about the individual people involved in each case.
Yeah, you're right. Transparency and accountability are going to be super important to make sure this board actually protects fairness and due process.
And then there's all the data collection and reporting. The Act wants regular reports on all sorts of things, from the number of people apprehended at the border to every time an agent uses force.
That's a good thing. Being transparent about the data is important. If we have access to this information, it helps hold agencies accountable. And it helps us see where things need to be improved.
But data can be twisted, misinterpreted. How can we be sure the data is actually being used responsibly and objectively?
That's the million-dollar question. This whole data collection thing, it only works if they actually analyze it properly and use it to make better policies for border security and immigration.
Okay, we've talked a lot about immigration and asylum, but this act also tackles another big problem of fentanyl. It's like they're really cracking down on fentanyl trafficking, right?
Oh, yeah, they're taking it seriously.
Yep.
The act acknowledges how bad the opioid crisis is and how much of it is fueled by fentanyl coming across the border. They're trying to cut off the supply.
So what's the plan? What's the act actually proposing to do about it?
It's a multi-pronged approach, right? Better screening at ports of entry, tougher penalties for traffickers, working with other countries to stop the flow of fentanyl at its source.
Sounds like they're hitting it from all angles. Are there any specific parts that stand out?
Well, they're specifically putting money towards buying and using advanced detection tech at border crossings, tools that can find even tiny amounts of fentanyl.
So they're not just going after the big shipments, they're trying to stop smaller quantities from slipping through too.
Exactly. And they're putting more money into training and equipping The law enforcement agencies who are actually doing this work,
Mhm.
they realize it takes special skills and resources to do this effectively.
It's a tough problem for sure. It'll be interesting to see if these measures actually work. Like, do they actually reduce how much fentanyl is getting into the country?
That's what we need to watch. The act's a step in the right direction, but we have to wait and see if it makes a real difference on the ground.
All right, so let's do a quick recap. We've talked about funding, changes to asylum procedures, more power for enforcement, what they're doing for Afghan allies, and the fight against fentanyl. This act is all over the place.
It really is. And we haven't even gotten everything yet.
Hmm.
This thing has huge implications for, border security, immigration, law enforcement. It's going to impact the lives of tons of people.
It's a lot to process. What are some of the main things you think people should take away from all of this?
Well, I think it's important to understand that this act's trying to balance a lot of competing interests. There's a big emphasis on security, yeah, but they're also trying to be humane and make sure the system is fair.
Yeah, it does seem like there's this tension between those goals. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, it's a real balancing act for sure. And it leaves us with a lot to think about. What parts of this act really stand out to you?
I keep coming back to how much it leans on technology. All that AI and automation at the border. Sure, it might make things more efficient, but it also makes you wonder about bias, transparency too. And what about errors? Those could have huge consequences for people.
Yeah, the potential for things to go wrong is scary. And what about these provisional non-custodial removal proceedings? Are they really going to be more humane than detention? Or is it just another way to keep tabs on people and control them?
That's the big question, right? The Act doesn't really lay out how those proceedings are actually going to work. So there's a lot of wiggle room. Could be ripe for abuse. And we can't forget about the voluntary departure thing. They say it's a choice, but how much of a choice is it really? When the alternative is maybe being detained for a long time or trying to figure out this crazy legal system.
It's a tough spot to be in. And the act doesn't deal with the reasons why people are migrating in the first place. Poverty, violence, climate change.
Yeah.
If we don't address those things, we're probably just going to keep seeing pressure at the border and more policies like this that are just reactions to the problem.
So where do we go from here? What should someone do if they want to really get what this act means for the future?
The most important thing is to stay informed. Pay attention to how they put this act into action, what's happening out there in the real world, how it's affecting migrants and people seeking asylum. This act brings up some really fundamental questions about how technology is changing borders, how we balance security and compassion in a world where everyone's connected. This debate's going to keep going, and we all need to be a part of it.
We've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive into the Border Act of 2024, from funding and technology to asylum procedures and what it means for Afghan allies. We've seen how complex and controversial this legislation is, but hopefully now you're equipped to follow along with how it all unfolds and to form your own opinions about its impact.